Well, thank you all for coming on this nice, sunny Saturday afternoon, coming from Eugene, Oregon, where we don't, this time of year, have too many sunny afternoons. It's just great. I've been walking around, went to the beach, got my toes in the sand. I don't quite feel like I'm at the beach until I have my shoes off and have my toes in the sand. Went downtown to the main street, saw a lot of nice things there. Just been kind of nice to get a little sense for your really nice community here. I know there's people in this area who are struggling with things, certainly, trying to figure out how to pay their bills, if they're going to keep their job, maybe something about kids in school. And then there's sort of some of the larger issues, some of the divisiveness that we see between groups of people. And then maybe add some of the bigger world issues. And what we're going to be talking about today are I'm just going to be sharing some ideas and kind of challenging you to then, you can apply these ideas to whatever area of your lives that you'd like to see progress and improvement. So we're going to talk about what our purpose is, because getting a better sense of our purpose can help us get this clear sense of who we really are and finding our value and worth. We're going to talk about where that value and worth come from. And we're going to explore what it means to view ourselves and others from a more spiritual or godlike point of view, and how that has a direct impact on not only our lives, but on the lives of others. And we're going to do all of this from the perspective of Christian Science. And sometimes people say, Christian Science, do those two words even go together, Christian and science? Why is it Christian Science? Well, it's Christian because it's based on the words and works of Christ Jesus and on the Bible, deeply rooted in the Bible. And it's science because, well, there's a lot of different definitions to science, but I like to think of science. When I think of science, I went to school up in Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo. Anyone know where that is? Yeah. Majored in agriculture. The actual title was crop science. So I was studying crops, and I would learn how plants and soils, how they related with each other. So as I learned and studied, then I got a better understanding, and that helped me be a better farmer. And that's the way I see science here, taking these words and works of Christ Jesus and then applying them in our lives so that we can find this progress and healing. Probably right now, something that's on everyone's mind still, it's been a month since Russia invaded Ukraine, and we're all, I'm sure, praying about that situation there. And one of the things that came to me is that what's really going on is that there's being a stirring up. There's being an uncovering of some of this domineering, sort of bullying, maybe some hatred, maybe some misunderstanding. All those things, they were always there, but it's being stirred up. And it's being stirred up to be healed. If you look at everywhere from the United States to Russia, how people are standing up and protesting and saying, no, we're not going to let this happen. So I think that even though it's tough, and there's going to be a lot of issues and challenges for a lot of people, in the end, the world is going to be a better place. Because these things were just lying kind of dormant, and now they're being brought to the surface to be destroyed, really, to be eliminated, to be minimized. The Master Christian, Christ Jesus, he brought about all kinds of freedom to people's lives. He brought about peace. He was called by some people the Prince of Peace. And he once said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God." Well, how can we do that? How can we be peacemakers? How can we help in this situation that seems halfway around the globe? I just got a text from a friend today who's actually going to go to Poland to help out. Well, if we don't do that, what else might we do? Well, it starts with ourselves, right? Being peacemaker, first with ourselves, coming to peace with ourselves and who we are, what our real nature is, and knowing our value and worth, and then kind of having that permeate out to others. and recognizing that value and worth in others. Mahatma Gandhi once said, I will not let others walk in my mind in their dirty feet. I think that's a great way to be a peacemaker, to not let anyone else, not think of anyone else with their dirty feet. I don't know about you, but for me, sometimes if someone I think does something wrong to me, I've been wronged, or done something pretty bad, I just have a hard time even thinking anything good about that person. So maybe at first, not letting them in with their dirty feet might just mean to not think of them at all. But I don't think that that's what really brings the healing. What brings the healing then is their feet. In our mind, we have to wash their feet. Whatever it is that we think about them, their character that's not godlike, it's just dirt. It's no part of who they really are. And so we can just wash that off. And that's really the best way that we can bring progress and healing in these areas, is to wash those feet, see people more clearly for their godlike nature. And so that's what we'll be talking about. Now, just have a little example of what it really means to be valued or needed. I'd like to give a little illustration here. And in order to do that, I need you guys to imagine something with me. Can you guys do that? Are you feeling in the imaginative mood? Great. Can you do this? Imagine that you're a bolt. That's what I was. A bolt? Yes. I'll even help you out. You know those bolts that you see in all the bins and boxes and all the hardware stores all around? You guys have hardware stores around here, right? You have Ace, True Value. Good. Well, just imagine that you're just one of those bolts in all those bins and boxes in all of Southern California, and you're just one of them. Now, how valuable would you feel? What's that? Not very valuable, yeah. But what if you found that you were a specially made bolt? Would that help a little bit? And what if you found that you had a purpose, that you were a bolt with a purpose? And that your purpose was to hold these beams together on a bridge. Now, I know you guys have bridges around here, right? Do you have any of these big like steel bridges with beams? What's the name of a big bridge like this around here? Anyone know? Vincent Thomas? Vincent Thomas. So you're a bolt on that Vincent Thomas, holding those piers together, and without you, the whole bridge would collapse. That's giving us a sense of how valuable we are. All the commerce that goes back and forth. There might be work. People have to work on both sides. You've got friends and family on both sides. All of that interaction that's going on. Without you, this one little bolt, none of that would happen. That gives us a sense of our value and worth. And then maybe as we look closer at this bridge, we'd find that we're not the only bolt on that bridge. There's maybe thousands of other bolts of different colors, sizes, shapes, and they each have their own little place. No one can be interchanged with any other one, and the littlest bolt is just as important as the biggest bolt. That's what we're going to be talking about today, how in God's universe, every one of us is needed even more than that bolt is needed. Because we've all been specially made by God. So we're not just someone among billions and billions of identical parts. We're not an unneeded, unnecessary, and interchangeable, replaceable part. Each and every one of us has been made on purpose, and so therefore with purpose. So let's talk a little bit about purpose and worth, what it is that makes that up. And to start, let's think about what it is that the world says gives us our value and our purpose. You know those bathroom scales that you jump on and they tell you how much? Well, we're going to make a scale like that, only it's going to be called the world's worthiness scale. So what are some of the things that go into this world's worthiness scale? What are some of the things that the world says makes us valuable?
Money in your bank account.
What's important to the world?
What's important to the world? Mon- Money in your bank account. Yep, that's probably a good one too. What else does the world say? Gives us our value? Position. Oh yes, position. Maybe our occupation. Yeah, our standing in society. What else? Number of followers. Yeah.
Every thought you think.
Every thought you think. What about gender, age, ethnicity, family background, all on and on and on. We're going to put all of these things in that the world says gives us our value or worth. Now, do you think there's other things that really give us our value and worth? Let's do this. Let's each take 8 seconds and think of someone in your life that you really value or respect. Just one person. Take a little bit of time. Does everyone have someone? Now, I'm not going to ask you who it is, but I want to know why you chose that person. Why was that person valuable to you? Let's hear some of your answers. Selfless.
You can count on this person, and if this person says they're going to do something, it's done.
Dependability, maybe honesty. Yes.
Financial, physical, mental stability.
Stability. Yes.
Eternity.
Great.
One of the Christian Science. The people in the church.
Great. Yes. What else?
You're a leader.
A leader. Yes. Integrity. Great. Good. I haven't heard anybody say it's because of how big their house was or how fast their car drives or how bright and shiny their shoes are. You guys are talking about those deeper, more, I'd say, godlike or spiritual characteristics. And that's what really gives us our value. And we think there's this world worthiness thing, but really that's all that gives us our value and our worth and nothing else. Getting just a little better sense of who we are, our true nature, is really what gives us these different qualities, this godlikeness. It's something bigger than ourselves. It doesn't come from us, it comes from God. God is the source. Infinite life and love is the source of all of this godlikeness that we all express. Sometimes if we're working with this world's worthiness scale, we might feel pretty high. We might feel, depending on our situation, other times we might feel kind of low. Or sometimes we might feel that we're judged on this world's worthiness scale. Or sometimes we might judge others on this world's worthiness scale. But as we start to see this, it's this godlikeness that gives us our true nature and identity. That's when we start to recognize our true value and worth. Well, I know today a lot of people don't even believe in God, or they kind of question God, or they wonder if God even exists. And I think that's because we know the world's so big, and sometimes the sense of God that we get is such a small sense of what or who God is. So if we're that expression of God, all that goodness that's God, let's just talk a little bit about what God is, to get a little better sense of what God is. Jesus said that God is spirit. So God's not this man or person somewhere, but this presence or power that we can really feel in our lives. The Bible says that God is truth. It's not just your truth or my truth or a truth, but God is the truth. So God is the source of all that's true, real, actual, good in our lives. That all comes from God. The Bible says that God is life. And life is what gives us our joy, our activity, our health, our liveliness. That all comes from God as life. And maybe the most familiar, the Bible says that God is love. Bible's just full of accounts of God's tender love, helping people out of all kinds of tough situations. And the Bible also tries to describe this love of God. And because it's infinite, it can be described in many different ways. Here's one. Like an eagle that rouses her chicks and hovers over her young, so he spread his wings to take them up and carried them safely on his pinions or on his feathers. And what I love about this passage is it shows several aspects to the nature of God as love. It shows the tenderness of God's love. God hovering over us. It's like God's doting over us, knows all of our needs and supplies them. And it also shows the strength of God's love. Maybe we've come upon some obstacle in our lives. God's love just puts us on its back and takes us up and over whatever that obstacle is. That's God as love. There's one more aspect that I'd like to talk about today. We could go on and on and on about all of the different aspects of God, and we can all keep learning more and more, expanding this sense of what God is. But the one I'd like to talk about this afternoon is where the Bible says that God is the only creator, the only cause. Now, when you hear that word cause, is there another word that you relate that to? Effect. That is right. Every cause needs an effect. It can't be an effect unless there's a cause, and vice versa. If I'm up here blowing on a horn, beating on a drum, that's the cause. There's going to be an effect, which is music. I like that one. Sound or, music. And it's the same in God's infinite universe. God being infinite, life and spirit and love needs to be expressed. And that's where we all come in, expressing God's joy and intelligence and harmony and peace. And that's really our purpose. It's to be that inevitable, every cause needing an effect. So we're the inevitable effect of God's love. Now, another aspect to God, I guess, is that God is infinite, that God is all. Well, if God is all, then God must be infinitely expressed. But if any one of us here didn't exist, then there'd be a little less of God. There'd be a little less joy or harmony, intelligence, whatever it is that we're expressing. If any one of us wasn't here, there'd be a little less of that. And so God wouldn't be all. And so that's what helps us show why we're needed. We're needed to complete this infinite universe that is God. Well, these are some pretty big ideas about God. The important thing is that we take these ideas, remember, as a science, and then apply them. Put them like in the top of our thinking so that we're thinking about these ideas as things come up in our everyday lives. And there's a woman that I know who did this, and I'd like to share her story just to kind of show you how this kind of, by viewing ourselves just more clearly for who we really are, how this can have such an impact on our lives. There's a woman that I know who for many years, well, growing up, she was never told that she was valued or needed. She grew up in a really dysfunctional, it was abusive, her family. So she was never told that she was loved or valued or needed. And she had a lot of deep, dark periods of depression. And she had suicidal thoughts. And this came to a head when she was in her early 20s. And at this point in her life, she was nearly flunking out of school. She didn't have any money. She was broke. She didn't have any close friends or deep friendships. And she had a drug addiction. Well, have you ever had one of those nights where there's something on your mind and you're just tossing and turning and you can't think of anything else? Well, that's what she was having. She was just tossing and turning, thinking about her life prospects. And she realized that they were pretty dim. She was pretty hopeless. So much so that she came to the heart-wrenching conclusion that ending her life was her only option. So the next day, she wrote a suicide note. And then she headed for a bridge to jump off, a place where it was known in that area for people to jump off to end their lives. But as she was actually on her way to that bridge, she bumped into someone who was an acquaintance. And that acquaintance recognized that there was something wrong going on here, so she stopped her, and they chatted for a little bit. And then this other woman said, "You know, I have a book here, and I think you might find it helpful." And she handed her a copy of this book, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, written by the founder of the Christian Science movement, Mary Baker Eddy. And this book shows the Christian Science approach to understanding the Bible and to how we can live and experience those promises that are in the Bible. That's what I love about the Bible so much. It's just filled with promises. And whatever trouble we think we have in our lives, there's a promise of redemption or healing, a promise of getting a clear sense of who we really are. But religion was the last thing in the world that this woman thought she wanted at this point in her life. But because this other woman had been so kind to her, she took the book, and then they parted ways. She ended up a little later going home. And then she decided that she would read this book. But she was going to read it with the purpose of showing how ridiculous Christianity and religion were. And so as she read, she just fought and struggled and argued with all those ideas that it was presenting to her. These were new ideas about the nature of God, that God was an all-loving, all-good God, and therefore an all-forgiving God. And there were new ideas about herself, that she, as God's effect, or as God's offspring, she was only entirely pure, good, and lovable. Well, you know, the more she read that book, the more it started to make sense to her. And then she kind of looked around at her life and she realized that things were beginning to change. School had always been so difficult for her, she found that it just suddenly seemed easier. She later went on and she not only passed all of her classes, but then she went on and graduated and then went on to graduate school and got a master's degree. Her finances, that had always been such a stress and strain in her life, she found that her needs were met in easier, but more natural, easy ways. And she never again had that stress of trying to pay her bills. Friends, she found that she started to get deeper, closer companionships. She later went on, got married, had a long, loving marriage. That drug addiction that she had, she found that her desire for those drugs just slowly melted away until that desire was gone completely. And all of those dark periods and times of depression, those all slowly went away as well, and any suicidal thoughts until they were all completely gone. So you can see her whole life changed by getting this clear sense. What she said later was probably the most important thing was just getting this sense that she had a place and a purpose in life. Well, the founder of the Christian Science movement, Mary Baker Eddy, she had a tough life as well. She wasn't just starting out, or when she was reading the Bible as she was young, she wasn't looking to start some new philosophy or religion. With her tough life, she was looking for solutions. She was born in 1821 up in New England. And I'd say for a young girl of her age, she had a pretty normal childhood. She did have bouts of chronic illness that would sometimes keep her in bed more than others. Well, when she was in her early 20s, she fell in love and she got married. But then less than a year after that wedding, her husband caught yellow fever and suddenly died. And so she was left not only single, but pregnant. Well, after she had her child, her family tried to help with the child, but she also had her health issues. And so in the end, they thought maybe it would be best to have that child go and live with someone else. And a few years after that, that family ended up moving to a remote area in South Dakota. And if you can imagine transportation, communication at that time, basically for all intents and purposes, she lost all communication with her only child. You can imagine how tough that might be. And that coming just a few years after losing the love of her life. And then she had this chronic illness that was still bothering her. This was before women could vote. So you can imagine how difficult it was for her to find any kind of income that would steadily keep her going. There was a time when she was basically going from house to house, just staying with whoever would let her stay for a little while. I think probably today, for that short period of time, she probably would have been considered homeless. And you add all of this up, and you can see that if there was ever anyone who had reason to feel of little value, or maybe unneeded, unnecessary in the world, it could have been Mary Baker Eddy at that point in her life, before she discovered Christian Science. And she struggled on through her 20s and 30s, and it wasn't until her 40s that she had a real life-changing event. She had a hard fall, and her internal injuries were such that many thought she wouldn't survive. A few days after that fall, she was in her bed, and she started to read this account of a healing that Jesus performed. And suddenly, she started to feel better. She got up and got dressed and started to go about her daily activities. Just like any of us would be, she was just thrilled to be free from that pain. But she was also really puzzled. Because at first, she didn't see the connection between what she had read and how that had made her feel. See, that had made her feel that unbreakable connection to God's goodness. And then that's what had healed her body. So she dug into the Bible for several years to find out what it was that had healed her. And what she came to discover is that whatever exists in God's universe, in God's allness and goodness, must be entirely good. Therefore, whatever's inharmonious in our lives, it might be pain from an accident or an illness, some relationship or financial issue, whatever it is, whatever's inharmonious in our lives, that has no place in God's allness and goodness. And therefore, it has no real basis in who any of us truly are. Well, she was eventually cured, and not just from the effects of that accident, but suddenly from all that chronic illness that she'd suffered from for all those years. If you can just imagine that, having some illness for all your life. And she tried many of the different medical theories and systems of the time. But then after all that searching and all that suffering, to have finally found something to heal you, well, she just wanted to share it with the world. And that's really what brought about her writing Science and Health and forming the church and doing all the other things that she did, was that so that we can get this clear understanding of the nature of God. And we can find our value and purpose and worth to help us in our lives as well. Now for Mary Baker Eddy, healing wasn't just thinking good thoughts and then good things happen. It wasn't like trying to visualize good and then have it manifest, or some sort of just positive thinking. For her, it really took this clear understanding of God. That was the connection to healing. And as she really understood this, she wrote this awesome sentence. It is our ignorance of God, the divine principle, which produces apparent discord, and the right understanding of him restores harmony. Here she's using that word, divine principle, as just another word that shows the nature of God. Principles, whatever the basis, the foundation of all there is. So we could say it's our ignorance that God, infinite love, it's our ignorance that God, infinite love, or divine principle, which produces apparent discord. We could say it's our ignorance of the allness of God or the goodness of God, which produces apparent discord. And then that right understanding of God restores harmony. Well, I don't know about you, but my life doesn't always just seem to be perfectly harmonious. There's all kinds of things going on in my life, and then you add some of maybe the local issues, community issues, some of the bigger, larger world issues. All this stuff's being thrown at us. How do we get this right understanding of God right in the middle of all that's going on? That's where, for me, prayer can be so helpful. And prayer can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But let's think about prayer from this standpoint that we've been talking about today, this bigger sense of God, the allness of God, and how that can help us in our prayers. That's what we all want to do, have more effective prayers. Well, we know that God is all-knowing. So our prayer doesn't have to be something to try to inform God about anything. God already knows all that's real and good and true about every one of us. God's all loving. So we can see that our prayer doesn't have to be some sort of pleading with God to help us or trying to show God how worthy we are to be healed. No. God's love for us is unconditional. No matter what, we can feel that love of God for us. We know that God is everywhere. So our prayer doesn't have to be somehow to reconnect ourselves to God, because God's love is everywhere. So wherever we go, there's God's love and God's goodness. Now, prayer doesn't ignore some of the bad stuff going on in our lives. It doesn't ignore how painful it can feel, maybe when we're sick or some of the really tough situations we find ourselves in. Prayer doesn't just suddenly make the rest of our lives a bed of roses, but prayer is a way to eliminate these problems in our lives. You know how sometimes our lives seems to be a mixture of maybe good and bad, physical, spiritual, or maybe we feel like we're that way, like we're this mixture of physical and spiritual elements. Well, prayer helps us see that that's really just a small, limited sense of who we really are. And through prayer, as we see and feel that we're that connected to all that goodness of God, well, then that dark, limited sense of stuff just falls away. It's kind of, you guys have parks around here, right? You have what's the name of a park, maybe, that everyone would know about here? El Dorado Park. Okay, do they have benches in El Dorado Park? Good, all right. Well, let's say you're at El Dorado. Well, actually, this can't be here because I see the path is wet, and I guess it never rains around here, right? But let's say you're at a park, and you're sitting there. You can see, right? You can see the trees, the shrubs, the bushes, the little stump there, the bench. But then, as it starts to get darker, things begin to change a little bit. The trees disappear. You just can't see things quite for what they really are. And then maybe if you keep sitting there longer and you start letting your fears and your imagination carry you away, things can start to look pretty scary. And that stump over there might turn into some kind of a wild animal of some kind, and you might be afraid of it for hours. But then you remember you have your cell phone in your pocket, or maybe you have a flashlight, and you just shine it right on that stump, and then that animal goes away. It never really was there. It's our perspective. And that's really the way that I see that prayer brings about healing. It doesn't change anything, but it helps us see that allness of God's goodness that's right here. There's a woman that I know who had a healing, and I'd just like to quickly share it because I think it shows how this kind of prayer works and can bring healing to our lives. This woman one day, she got a pain in her abdomen, and it quickly increased until it was the worst pain she'd ever been in her whole life. It was the kind of pain that might make someone want to go to the emergency room. She knew she could do that. That was always an option. But she'd also been healed by this kind of Christian prayer before, so she was praying. Now, there's no one formula to prayer. Prayer isn't really the end game. Prayer helps us get to the end game, which is to feeling God's presence and goodness right here, getting a better sense of reality. But I'd just like to share how she prayed, because sometimes that can be helpful. So she said at first she realized that she was so all-consumed with this pain, with this illness, that she wasn't able to think of anything else. So she realized she had to turn her thought, as hard as it was, turn it away from that pain and that illness. And then as she did that, her thought moved to God, to the nature of God. And she said as soon as that happened, she just felt well taken care of, just suddenly well taken care of. And then she said the prayer that came to her was a very simple prayer, just two parts to it. First was that since God is all good, God never sent nor allowed pain or evil of any kind. And the second was that since God is all powerful, sickness or pain had no place in God's universe, and therefore had no place in her as an inhabitant in God's universe. Well, as she was praying, her husband was praying along with her, and then he started to read to her out of this book, Science and Health. And what he read just confirmed how she'd been feeling, getting this clear sense of her unbreakable connection to God's goodness. And as he read, that pain just went away until it was completely gone, and it never came back. Well, you can imagine not just the freedom, but the empowerment that kind of prayer gives. To go from this place of being in the worst pain you've ever been in to a place of prayer and then quietness and then feeling the presence of God's goodness and then having that pain just go away completely. She and her husband were just so grateful. And that's just one example of a healing that occurred through applying these kinds of thoughts and ideas. But you'll find that in Christian Science, healing is very common. It's expected. Healing through prayer. As a matter of fact, there's churches, societies of Christian Science all around the world. Not much unlike this one here at Fifth Church. And in every one of them, they hold Sunday meetings, and then Wednesday evening they hold a Wednesday meeting. And in every one of those meetings all around the world, there's a period of time set aside for people to share how they've been healed through this kind of prayer. All around the world, every week, people are sharing how they've been healed. The church headquarters is in Boston, and they publish a weekly and a monthly magazine. And in every one of those, there are accounts of people who've been healed through this kind of prayer. This book, Science and Health, the last 100 pages, all it is. Testimonies by people who've been healed just through the ideas that they got through reading the book. So you can see there's really a mountain of evidence that shows the practicality, the availability of this kind of Christian Science prayer. And it can be for all kinds of things, as I've been talking about today, giving some examples. It could be for things like contagious disease. That's something that's been in the news for the last couple of years. Hopefully we're seeing the tail end of that. There's a lot of people who look to the vaccinations to stay safe or to keep their family or other people safe. Well, we can also see that there's another way, this kind of Christian Science prayer. And anyone who is willing to pray in this kind of way doesn't need to be afraid in a pandemic. They don't need to be afraid of taking that vaccination either if that's the case for them. And I'm not saying one way or the other. I know better than that. But I am saying that whatever the case for us, we can rely on this kind of dependable prayer to keep ourselves and others safe. You know, it's really the same kind of healing prayer that Jesus used. Jesus healed all kinds of people. Sometimes, if those of you who've read the Bible, multitudes, it would say. And he healed people from all kinds of things. And he healed those who were rich as well as those who were poor. He healed those who were accepted in society as well as the outcasts. He didn't care about gender, age, race, any of that stuff. And he healed rather than judged or condemned those who had made all kinds of mistakes, made poor decisions in their lives. And he could do this because he could see that their only true nature was whatever is godlike, flowing straight from God, all that goodness. And then whatever's not godlike, it might have been blindness, or they couldn't walk, or maybe some kind of character issue, whatever that was. That had no real place in who those people were. And so just like that little animal in the stump, it just went away. And Jesus once told a story that helps us see our connection to God and how we can never be separated from God. No matter what we've done, no matter how far away we feel like we are, we can never be separated from God's goodness. And some of you may have heard this story. It goes like this. So there was once a young man, and he decided to ask for his inheritance, I think a little prematurely, as while his father was still alive. But his father gives him the inheritance, and off he goes. He wants to go as far away as possible. And he starts using up his inheritance, making poor decisions, and he gets lower and lower on his money supply, continuing to make poor choices, unwise. Finally, he ends up completely broke. He's so poor and so desperate that he has to get a job, and he gets a job feeding pigs. Now, I grew up on a farm. We had pigs. I love pigs. They're actually one of my favorite farm animals. But in this young man's culture, pigs were considered unclean. So he was doing the dirtiest, least respected job a guy could do. And you might imagine what that might be like today. Well, that's what he was doing. Now, when this man first got his money, if he'd had one of those handy-dandy world worthiness scales like we have, don't you think he probably felt pretty high on that scale, thinking maybe that his wealth and his family background gave him that value? But then as he started losing his money, don't you think he probably started feeling lower and lower until at this point he's at I think probably zero. I think the artist is a little generous there, but and that's the problem with valuing ourselves or our worth on this world's scale, because it's limited. And our lives are always changing. And at some point, we'll always find ourselves with that needle pointing low. I mean, if you're a student and you think that your value or worth is dependent on how you do as a student, and then you start doing poorly, or maybe you have to drop out of school, or maybe you graduate, what can you base your value or worth on? Or maybe you're a parent. I've done this, and you think your value or worth is dependent on how you do as a parent. Well, your kids are going to grow up and leave. And then what can you do? Or if it's on your job, your occupation, and then you get fired, or maybe you retire. Or maybe if you think it's based on some relationship, and then that goes awry. These are all really important aspects of our lives. But it's not so much what we do as how we do it. It's those godlike qualities that we're bringing right into our families, our school or our job, our community. That's what gives us our value and worth. Anybody here heard of Simone Biles? Yes. Who's Simone? Who is she?
Greatest American gymnast, female gymnast.
Yep, world gymnast, probably considered the most dominant female gymnast ever. And probably you may have heard what happened in the last Olympics. She was competing, the best gymnast in the world. She was competing, and she started to feel out of sorts. Do you remember this? And she had to withdraw from the Olympics. Well, some people criticized her for that. But she also received a lot of support. People understood that she was going through some tough times. Matter of fact, she felt so much support that just a couple of days after she withdrew, she tweeted this: "The outpouring of love and support I've received has made me realize I'm more than my accomplishments and gymnastics, which I never truly believed before." Just love that. Realizing more than our accomplishments. If you think of a gymnast or maybe some other athlete, what are some of the qualities they express out there on the floor or field or wherever? Precision. Strength. Balance, yeah. Courage. I'm waiting for my favorite one, grace. They're so graceful. Yeah, these are these godlike qualities. And whether or not you're competing, right, she realized that she could be expressing these, maybe not her words, but that she could be expressing these right out in her everyday life. She didn't have to be competing to do that. That's how we can find our value and worth, and those qualities. When people retire, sometimes they start to wonder, what's my purpose now? What am I going to do now? Right in the heart of the pandemic, when there were all these stay-at-home orders, a lot of the mental health officials were really concerned because there were so many people just stuck at home, and they were all saying, does anything I do really matter anymore? But if we can base our value or worth not on what we do, not on these accomplishments, but on something that's permanent, then we'll see that our value and worth is always permanent. This effect, this needed effect of God, all these godlike qualities. And we'll see that our value and worth never diminishes, never depletes, never gets old. We're all needed just as much as we've ever been. Well, back to this young man in the pig pen. He starts thinking about his father. Even though he's a long ways off and he decided to leave his father, he starts to remember that his father always had enough food to feed all those hired hands. And here he is, busting his tail and still starving. So he decides that he's going to go back to his father. But after all he's done, after all he's squandered, he just can't go back as a son. So he decides he's going to go back as a hired hand. He just doesn't feel he deserves good in his life. And I bet you we've all felt that way before. And if we look deeply in our thought, we have to see how and where am I feeling this way? Maybe I just don't feel like I deserve good in some health situation or some financial or some relationship. Maybe we've done something so egregious that we feel like we can't ever make up for it. Or maybe we just keep making the same mistake over and over again. Or I've even thought sometimes, I wonder if I'm really such a good person after all. That's like looking at that really small, limited, narrow sense of who we are, that dark, distorted sense, as we turn our thought back, that we are that offspring of God, that emanation of all that goodness that comes from God. We'll see that we are always deserving of good in every aspect of our lives, and so is everyone else. Well, this young man, he learns this lesson, takes that long road back to his father. His father's right there to welcome him back, gives him a big hug, and refuses to accept that he come back as a hired hand. Why do you think that is? Why did he refuse that? Because he loved him? Right. Because the son is his nature. That can never change. That's his title. That can never change. And it's the same with you and me. God's offspring. That's who we are. And that can never change. Well, the examples that I've given today have shown how individuals' lives have been changed through getting this clear sense of their true nature, their purpose, and their worth. But if you look at it, you'll see that there's actually other people involved. Like the woman who was going to commit suicide. There was that other woman who took the time, just a little time out of her day, stopped, gave her a copy of Science and Health. Didn't take much out of her life. And then there was the woman with the pain whose husband was there. And even in this story, there is the father who's always there. And I bet if we all here think about it, there's ways in which we're showing people their value and worth as well. It might be a smile on a bus or helping somebody out. I just met somebody yesterday who helps people on their computers. He has like 80 clients, and he just helps them figure things out, and he does it all for free. These are the kinds of things that we can all be doing to show others their value and worth. And even if we think that we're so isolated that we never come into contact with anybody, there's always something that we can do, and that is to wash their feet. Whoever we think of, and maybe consciously think about people and wash all that dirt that we think is on their feet and just accept them into our thought with those clean feet. Well, now for the biggest question of the day. What is needed more in a bread recipe? Flour or water or yeast? Yeast. Everybody agree that yeast is the thing most needed in a bread recipe? No, all of it. Yeah, usually it kind of starts with yeast, and then people start thinking and realizing that each and every one of those is unique and essential, and you can't replace them. You can't have two yeasts and no flour, right? They're all irreplaceable. And because of that, bread can't be made without each one of them. They're all equal in value. And that's how it is in God's universe, that we're each essential, unique, and equal in value. And that includes those who we might not be getting along with so well. They're equal as well. It includes those from different backgrounds, those who have different points of view. And it even includes those who we might think are a threat to ourselves or to others or to things that we hold dear. Now, that doesn't mean that we just accept or allow ungodlike thoughts or actions, either in ourselves or in others, but it's really our way of bringing progress to some of these bigger problems in the world. One last story. I know a man who, for many years, felt harassed by law enforcement. He was pulled over and searched and followed more than anyone else. One time, he was followed by over 12 police officers, and he was just there on his little bicycle, and he didn't have any kind of police record. So the only thing that he could attribute it to was the color of his skin, because this man's black. And it really made him angry and resentful. And then one night, it happened again. He was in a shopping mall, and forgot to turn on his lights, pulled out onto the street, and whoop, he was just pulled right over by a police officer. And as the officer approached, the officer started yelling at him, saying that he smelled drugs in his car and demanded that he get out so he could search his car. Well, this man wasn't so sure that getting out was such a good idea. But the officer said, if you don't get out on your own, I'm just going to call a judge, get a search warrant, and then I'll search your car. Either way, your car is going to be searched. But then the officer took a step back. And I think maybe in a moment of grace, he said, I'll give you a minute to decide whether or not you're going to let me search your car. Well, in the past, this man would have been boiling over by this point. But this time it was different. He'd taken up the daily study of the Bible and Science and Health. As a matter of fact, this was a Wednesday evening, and he was on his way home from one of those Wednesday meetings that I was talking about earlier. And he didn't take what he had heard and just leave it at the door. He was getting this clear sense of everyone's true nature. And so that prepared him as well as could be for this kind of situation. So when the officer took that step back, gave him a minute, he was praying. And he said that as he prayed and thought about it, he realized that actually there was more than one by now. These police officers, they were all involved in public service. And he was too at that time. And so he could feel that little bond with them. And then he realized, well, the purpose of police officers is to provide protection and safety, harmony, ensure that people obey the rules, and he could go along with all of that. In a way, he was seeing the godlikeness of these police officers. He might not have used those words, but that's what he was doing. And then he could see that whatever was not godlike, some of that bullying or whatever it was, the racism, that had nothing to do with who that police officer really was. And it was just about a minute. And then he noticed that the officer had stopped yelling. And he noticed a change in the demeanor of the officer. And in a minute, that officer just quietly walked over to him and kind of leaned over and said, "I'm sorry to tell you, sir, but I'm going to have to give you a ticket for driving without your headlights." No mention of drugs, no mention of a search. And the man accepted the ticket and drove off. And he later wrote about this. A couple of sentences. He said, "My prayers helped not only me, but the officers involved as well." This is showing how our prayers can have an effect on our community and on others. Then he continues, "I learned that I don't ever have to feel helpless about injustice of any kind." And I think that really addresses sometimes we feel helpless. Maybe in the Ukrainian situation, or some issues that just seem so big that we feel helpless. But when we recognize the power of our prayer and its effect on others, we won't feel helpless. And then he ends with, "And I now see prayer as a proactive way to handle tense situations." And I think we could all agree that that was a pretty tense situation, and one that we've probably seen far too many times end in a violent way. So you can see that by viewing others more clearly as they really are, that doesn't ignore that bad stuff that goes on. But it's really our way of bringing progress to these different areas. I'd like everyone to just take another 5 or 6 seconds and think about maybe some of the larger areas, issues that are going on. It could be the situation in Ukraine, it could be some of this divisiveness, or maybe some of the disparity, economic disparity, the homeless, whatever it is. Just take one of those situations, one of the community or world situations, and just keep that in thought for just 10 seconds. Has everyone got one? Got one of those? So now apply this to that. Now see how that problem, that world or local, whatever it is, that issue, the only way that we're going to come to permanent progress in whatever it is you're thinking of, all these different things, every one of them, the only way that we're going to find permanent progress is by starting from this basis that everyone is equal. Just think about whatever it is you're thinking about, right? That everyone is equal. That's got to be the basis for that. And the wonderful thing is, we don't have to wait. We don't have to wait for anyone else to get it. We just have to know that for ourselves, see that for ourselves, just like this man did. He saw it, and that had an impact on those officers and on that situation. And this is what's going to be bringing this progress and healing to our communities and to our world. Well, today we've talked about this world's worthiness scale, and we've seen how that's no way for us to determine our true value in nature. What about our value in God's eyes? Does God have some kind of scale that we're being weighed on? Remember this bigger sense of God. God has infinite love, has infinite spirit. Does that God have some sort of scale that he's weighing us on? No, of course not. And each and every one of us is essential. So there's no scale needed. There's no degrees or shades to essentialness. And we can all get a clear sense of our true value and worth and of our essentialness. We can look more deeply into the Bible. We can look into science and health. And then apply that. And as you do that, you'll find that your life, you'll find progress and healing in every avenue of your life. Well, I just hope that some of the things that I've said today have touched something that makes you want to look a little more deeply into this. And I hope that you'll find that by looking into our value and worth, that you'll get this clear sense of who you are and of everyone else. And I'm just going to end with a passage from the Bible. And then after that, Marilee's going to come up and talk a little bit about how you can get more ideas or how you can get your questions answered, maybe how you can get a Bible or science and health. But this is the passage. It's from Romans. I am convinced that nothing can ever separate us from God's love. Neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither our fears for today nor our worries about tomorrow. Not even the powers of hell can separate us from God's love. And I hope that in this hour you've just been feeling God, just loving you, cherishing you, feeling that unbreakable connection to God's infinite love, and that's what gives you your value and purpose and worth. And that all of this just makes you want to go out and live your lives as that awesome person that God has created you to be. Thank you. Have a good afternoon.